Good afternoon. Over the weekend, we saw many peaceful protests across our beautiful state, from Forks on the peninsula to Walla Walla to the Palouse, to Yakima to the Rainier Valley in Seattle. Thousands of people in our state have been crying out for justice. And these footsteps in the streets, I think and I hope, are footsteps in history that can provoke us in taking big strides to fight against the systemic racism that has afflicted our communities for decades. To the protesters, I want you to know this. I hear you. Black lives matter. And because of many of these protests, many people across the country are starting to understand the real meaning of that term. This is a moment unlike anything we've seen. It's a moment to do things differently, to do them better, and to do them with a real commitment to change. On Friday, I pledged that our state patrol will conduct a review of the investigation of the death of Manny Ellis in Tacoma. And it will do an independent investigation of anything that needs investigating after that review. It has to get to the bottom of every single piece of evidence that has a bearing on that loss, and it will prepare that report as soon as it can. We need to make sure this is a fair, just, and thorough examination. Community members, family members deserve this, as we know. And the state deserves it as well. At that point, this information will be forwarded to Bob Ferguson, who, as Attorney General, I will ask him at the appropriate moment to conduct his own decision to determine what, if any, prosecutorial action should be taken by the Attorney General. Around the state, communities are demanding change at every level of our government, and leaders cannot just reject racist ideas. They're not asking just for vague promises. We need action, we need policies, and we need them as rapidly as possible. In the last 2 weeks, I've been in many discussions with members of the Black Lives Matter movement in King County, the Legislators' Black Caucus, the members of Color Caucus, family members of those who've lost loved ones, and Tacoma community leaders. And I know that we have to rethink policing and public safety in Washington state. And we've got to make sure that those discussions are not in a vacuum. To that end, I will be convening a diverse group of Black leaders and representatives of other marginalized communities, as well as representatives of law enforcement, to develop proposals to submit to the legislature. My hope is to collaborate with this group to write meaningful legislation in our state. Now, there are many ideas that I know will be considered, but I want to talk about three things that certainly need to be action items. First, we need an independent investigative and prosecutorial process for cases of alleged police misconduct resulting in death or serious harm to citizens. This would involve the creation of a state investigative unit that is totally separate from any other law enforcement entity geographically in the state. Second, we need to rethink the use of police force and look more broadly at police tactics. Clearly, this means that there has to be a restriction on the use of chokeholds. Third, we need to create a legally enforceable obligation that law enforcement officers must report misconduct by their fellow officers. Now, we know that much more is needed. And what I mean by that is that the tenor of these moments gives us an opportunity, I believe, to take additional steps to the larger efforts in addition to police misconduct issues. Police misconduct may be the byproduct of institutional racism, but fixing that alone will not solve the underlying problems that bedevil us, of inequity in education, in inequity in healthcare, in economic inequities that defy imagination. All of these things have to be on the table for action, and I look forward to working with legislators in the community to make sure that that happens. We know that people in authority have a responsibility both to listen and to take action. So we're bringing people to the table to be proactive in these discussions, because we know that the responsibility to change things ultimately rests on those who actually have authority to actually take action. So we're going to, in our discussion with this group, those tenets will be foremost in mind. I'd also like to thank the protesters who faced a very scary situation on Capitol Hill Sunday night when a man ran his vehicle down the street and ended up shooting an individual who tried to intervene. Individual protesters took brave actions to make sure this incident did not lead to even more dangerous escalation, as did emergency responders medically and in law enforcement. So with that, I'd like to have some comments about our COVID efforts, which are continuing, obviously. And with that, I wanted to ask John Weisman to address some advice we'd have for folks who have been involved in these protests. John.
Thanks, Governor Inslee. So anyone who's attended a large gathering, including a protest, and was unable to maintain 6 feet of distance, really the single best thing someone can do is stay home and stay away from others for 14 days after that. Again, if you are going to a protest or a rally, the idea is to take every precaution. And if you haven't done that, really staying away from others is the best thing you can do. And if you develop any symptoms, anybody who develops symptoms suggestive of COVID, whether that be a fever, a cough, shortness of breath, chills, headache, loss of taste, a new loss of taste or smell, sore throat, really then should go ahead and get tested. And again, that applies to whether or not you've been to a protest or not in terms of getting tested. We have plenty of testing supplies for this. We've got access for folks to do that, and we're really encouraging that. Now, if somebody doesn't have symptoms and they really want to go ahead and get a test, you should feel free to do that. Just like I said last week, feel free to get a test if that's what you feel like you need to do. And if you do that, the thing that I also want to caution against is that if you get a negative test, that doesn't mean that you haven't necessarily become infected, because it can take up to 14 days to develop symptoms and certainly to test positive. So even if you test negative and you're still in that window period, the single best advice is to stay home and stay away from others. So I think that's really the main message, Governor, from a public health perspective on anybody who might have attended these protests.
Yeah, and if I can, John, I'm going to add one thing too, is that people, if you're getting a test, so if you've got enough concern that you're getting a test, if you have symptoms, isolate even while you're waiting for the test results, because even if you're asymptomatic, you could be a transmitter, and certainly early in this disease, you can be a transmitter. So even early, even before you've got test results, while you're waiting, it makes sense to isolate. Would you agree with that, John?
Absolutely, 100% right.
Great. Okay, I wanted to give a few more information about our status of our restart programs. Right now, just 5 counties in our state remain in phase 1 of reopening. King County is in a modified phase 1, while 25 counties are in phase 2. 8 counties are currently in phase 3. Today, Skamania County applied for phase 3, and that will be reviewed by the Department of Health. Additionally, Asotin County became eligible for phase 3 today, and by the end of the weekend, there will be 10 more counties eligible to apply for phase 3. Adams, Grace Harbor, Lewis, Cowlitz, Grant Island, Jefferson, Mason Pacific, and San Juan. Now, I should note, eligible, that doesn't mean actually qualifying, because we have to have confidence that we've got the contact tracing and isolation protocols in place to make sure that we're going to stay on top of this virus. I do want to note, too, that we still have some places in our state. The one that comes to mind first is Yakima County, where we are seeing increases in infections that are very, very disturbing. And the reason I mention that is that I think Washingtonians have to keep two things in mind, not just one. One is that we are able to reopen many of our businesses and the like, and that's a cause for joy. But at the same time, we simply have to continue this effort and our individual actions to tamp down this virus. I talked to a friend the other day about Yakima County. If folks will start wearing masks in Yakima County, hopefully we can get on top of this and start reopening Yakima. But that's simply we need to do. And we've had discussions. We'll have more to say of this in the next few days. Our state health department has been in Yakima trying to provide expertise. And we all got to pull on this rope if we're going to be successful. We want to reopen all of our counties to get this job done. With that, I'm happy to stand for questions.
First question comes from Rachel with AP.
Governor, with a potential special session sometime this summer related to state revenues, is there any legislation related to policing that might be taken up then, or are you waiting for a final report from the new task force for next year's session? And then secondly, do you plan to keep the National Guard activated for the protests?
It's possible that this group would have recommendations by the time there's a special session, so I would not rule that out. It just depends on how fast that group can get a plan together, and secondly, when the session is. So I would not rule that out. We'd like to take action earlier rather than later, obviously, and we want to get it right at the same time. And this is a moment, I do believe, where it's, if you look at history, things are static, and then boom, the conditions exist where big changes can take place. I think we are possibly in a moment like that. And we want to make sure that we keep our focus on this to get this job done. So whenever this is, we've got to keep our focus on it to get this job done. And I want to thank all the peaceful protesters. By the way, by the thousands. This was quite remarkable to see how broad-based this was, geographically and otherwise, of thousands of Washingtonians coming out wanting justice. That's a magic moment that we have to seize. The Guard is being substantially demobilized. Over half of the Guard will be demobilized, I believe, in the next 24 hours. And we're looking forward to that continuing.
Next question comes from David with the Seattle Times.
Yeah, hi. A question for the governor and then a question for Secretary Weissman. For the governor, it almost sounds like two different realities you're talking about here. On the one hand, you're offering support for these protests that bring thousands of people together, and on the other hand, we're hearing we have to continue to work to tamp down this virus. And I'm wondering if you're worried about a conflicting message being sent, especially when the vast majority of the state still gatherings of more than 5 people are not permitted, which in the shadow of these protests just kind of seems absurd. And then for Secretary Weissman, how worried are you about the job of contact tracing being made more difficult by these protests?
I'll go first. I think this is, it's a lot like life. It's complicated. You bring up to points that appear to be contradictory, and like a lot of things in life, and you got to make decisions. Thousands of people have made a decision that the virus of racism is important enough to fight back by peaceful protests. And we have encouraged them to do so in the most distanced manner as possible, including to wear masks, which we heartily recommend with the strongest version that we can to wear masks in these circumstances. But the fact is that, we would not have the event to change that course even were we to desire. And there's a First Amendment right to petition your government for redress of grievances. It's in the founding documents of the United States, and that has to be respected as well. But we will continue to urge people to be as careful as possible for their benefit. John?
In terms of Yeah, in terms of public health, certainly we're concerned about the potential uptick now in cases of COVID-19. That is why we are certainly asking people to think about their attendance, and if they are choosing to attend, to do everything they can to keep themselves safe. First of all, that is if you're not ill, or if you're ill, certainly don't go to any large public gathering. If you're going to choose to go and you're over 65 or chronic underlying health conditions, you ought to give that really serious thought, just as anybody should. And making sure that if you go, that you are keeping your distance to the best you can of at least 6 feet, of using your hand sanitizer, not touching objects that you don't need to touch, and making sure that you're wearing a cloth face covering. All those things can help reduce the risk. So if you feel compelled to do this, that's what you can do from a public health perspective. Now, I will say, again, the governor's leadership weeks ago really prepared us for any potential surges by assuring that we had a large pool of people who can do the contact tracing, with the National Guard assisting us. We have over 700 some National Guard who are trained and who can help assist with this, as well as Department of Licensing folks, over 700 people who are trained. So I would say public health folks, we're concerned, we're watching. We want to see if there's additional spread, and we have taken action even before this in case we saw a spike, that we would be prepared. So that's what we're doing, and that's what we're focused on.
I want to add something to that folks should know. I have been a dog on a bone, as John would tell you, to get this job done. This is absolutely vital to our success, to have a high performance of contact tracing and isolation. And to that end, we have insisted that counties, before they allow to go from one phase to another, have to actually prove to us that they have a strong contact tracing and isolation system to assure that a high percentage of people are contacted every single day to encourage them to be isolated. And so we have performance metrics that people have to show us, and we look at these almost on a daily basis. So we're committed to this, and we're going to make sure that job gets done. I'm glad we've been able to give counties the resources to do it, and we have a full expectation that they'll get this job done. And we have means to make sure that that happens, because we have, in some degree, a decision-making capability on these phases. I do want to point out on the protests, my administration has been entirely neutral and fair on these protests. The protests against police violence and the protests against my stay-home orders were both treated the same, which is they were allowed to proceed without being quashed, either here in Olympia or otherwise. And I just want to make sure people understand that.
Okay. Next question, we're going to try S6 with Kyra.
Hello, Governor. Hope you were hearing me okay.
Yes.
Two questions for you, Governor. While you may not want to fully defund police, are there areas where you would move significant resources away from policing and put into some of the other areas you think are necessary to deal with, such as healthcare and education? And second question, on chokeholds, why not ban chokeholds altogether?
Well, listen, I'm sure we're going to have a discussion about budgets, and I know that the real effort here is to increase access to early childhood education, increase access to college education, increase access to mental health, increase community support systems for communities in a whole. That's the real goal here. And we got to find a way to do that. Now, it's going to be tough because we have a $6 billion hole in our budget. But that's the real need here, that we want to try to reduce the income inequity that is so horrific in our community. That's the goal. If there are things that can be trimmed, sure, we'll have those debates. But I got to say, you know, we don't want to cut a service that if some woman's being domestically abused, they want to get that call answered pronto so that that can be a police response. We don't want to lose that response. Your second question on chokeholds, these need to be restricted. Possibly there are things where life itself is in danger, where maybe there's something available, but the police are going to have to convince us that that's the situation. And that's why I'm calling for a restriction. We have a restriction for the State Patrol. That type of restriction or otherwise need to be statewide across all police agencies. There is a lethality associated with them that they need to understand, and they need to be restricted.
Next question comes from Jim with the Spokesman Review.
Yes, Governor, I'm wondering if you have seen the proposals that the departments are submitting for their 15% budget cuts, and whether you know of anything that's being proposed that is so draconian that it absolutely cannot be done.
I haven't looked at these in detail. There are two purposes of this budget exercise. One, to require agencies to really identify if those cuts are necessary, where they should come. There's a second reason as well, which is to alert the public to what those 15% cuts really look like and what services actually will be lost or diminished. That's an important thing as well. It falls trippingly off the tongue to say just cut things 15%. It's more difficult when you find out it's going to cut some service that you really need in your neighborhood or in some legislator's district. So it has both purposes. So I don't have a specific answer to you, except we got some really tough decisions to make.
Next question comes from Drew with King 5.
So, Governor, you have explained that the Attorney General will be able to review the Manuel Ellis case up in Tacoma, but there are folks who are on your front steps of the Capitol right now demanding a complete new investigation to get it out of Tacoma, where you have Pierce County detectives investigating Tacoma police. Do they have another option? Would it require the law that you've mentioned, creating a new agency for that? Because a review is one thing, but these folks want an entire new investigation. Is that even possible?
Well, in a sense, yes. Here's what we're going to do here. I'm told the Pierce County Sheriff's is wrapping up their investigation. I'm told days away from issuing a final report. The State Patrol will conduct all investigation that is necessary to a thorough investigation of this event. That may involve interviewing witnesses. It may involve analyzing physical evidence. It may involve getting new physical evidence. It may involve hiring new forensic experts. All of those things are going to be done, and it's important that they be done. Now, are they going to get a second mugshot of the officers if there's already been a mugshot? Probably not. There may be some things that have already been done that are not necessary. But I can assure you, because I will be very insistent on this, that the State Patrol will do every single investigatory action, interviews, forensic analysis, taking evidence, evaluating videotape evidence. All of those things are going to be done. That is very, very important. So that's going to get done. Now, when that is done, the Attorney General will, at my request, review this and will make a prosecutorial decision. It may involve prosecution. It may involve not a prosecution, but I will ask him to make that decision based on this new thorough review and investigation of this incident, and that's going to get done. And these folks deserve to get that done. One other comment, because I've talked to some of the folks in Tacoma about this. People have asked the Attorney General to do the investigation. In our state, the Attorney General does not have investigatory resources or actually authority to do the witness statements, the forensic evidence. Bob Ferguson doesn't know how to take a fingerprint. And so the Attorney General is not the expertise. The State Patrol is the group that has the State Crime Lab and all the witness gathering information to get this done. So I'm very confident at the end of the day, there's going to be a very thorough investigation done by an independent body, the combination of the Washington State Patrol and the Attorney General making an independent decision. Now, that's important as well. This needs to be independent. We can't have people sort of mixing their work with the Pierce County Sheriff or the Pierce County Prosecutor. those folks got to be totally separate. We need to have an independent review of this. So we can't have Bob working with the prosecutor in Pierce County, nor can we have the State Patrol working with the Sheriff's Department. This needs to be totally separate.
Next question comes from Jerry with the Everett Herald.
Governor, two questions. First, just on that task force, do you already have the members? If not, are you going to invite some of the Republican lawmakers from the House and Senate to participate? And secondly, just to follow up on what you were just talking about, you said one of the action items for this group is the need for an independent investigation and prosecution of officer-involved killings. You've just described what's going to happen in the case of Manuel Ellis. Is that not enough? Do you need something different than you already imagine with the State Patrol and Attorney General?
Well, I think, in answer to your second question, look at this is, we're doing the best we can right now. There's not a statutorily created agency, independent agency. So this is the best source we have for an independent investigation and review now. But we're going to talk to the community about whether that's a separate subdivision in the State Patrol, whether it's a separate agency. We're going to talk to the community to see what that looks like. It will need to be financed. We'll need to hire people that will be available to be able to do this work, because in essence, it will be substituting for the county sheriffs who, the way this works now under 940, essentially a lot of the cities contracted with county sheriffs to do the investigation of the city police departments. So the state will somehow have to pick up that burden financially to get that job done. What that looks like, whether it's in the State Patrol or a separate agency, I don't know the answers to those yet. We're going to talk to the community that this group that I talked about for those ideas. We have not identified members of the task force yet. We'll be doing that in the next few days and weeks. As far as who is on or not, we haven't made decisions in that regard yet.
Next question comes from Keith with Coma.
Governor and Secretary Weissman, this is the first full weekend that the counties around Puget Sound will go to the next phase. How are you hearing anecdotally that they're doing? Are they adhering to your this is day one of the mask mandate for places of employment. How is that going? And is it possible that if you're not by yourself, but you are well outside the 6-foot limit, that you don't have to wear a mask all day long?
John, you want to talk about a review so far?
Right, so at the moment, best I can tell, things are going fine. I have not, the ability to see some of these effects take a week or so, given the symptoms from COVID starting, from 5 days, on average 6 days, to up to 2 weeks. So we're watching that, and we'll be watching the data carefully around that and understanding where there might be outbreaks and what those outbreaks are. And in terms of masks, I don't have any line of sight into that other than my own organization where employees are wearing their masks. There are a few of us around who are working, not many of us, but everybody's got their masks on.
Yeah, I would say that there's a differential. I go places and I see, the big majority of people wearing masks, and I've heard reports in other places where a minority of people are wearing it when they go into the grocery store. So I think there is a differential, but the biology and the chemistry is the same everywhere in the state of Washington, and that is that this is just such a supremely important thing for us to do right now. And it is a little difficult for us because we haven't done it. A lot of other cultures have done this traditionally, and what they have found is that a number of the societies that have done this sort of just as a matter of habit, almost a matter of etiquette, have had lower transmission rates. And so the science is quite strong about why these masks work right now. So this is a new thing for us, and it's like anything else that's new. It's probably going to take a time for us to adapt to it. But I sure hope people do in increasing numbers, because I just want to get back to normal. I don't want to have to go to a shutdown again. We want to prevent a second wave. We want to prevent dozens of deaths. And I really believe we can do that if we will hew to this thing that really is in our control. So I hope that that'll increase.
Next question comes from Jim with the News Tribune.
Governor, you mentioned that there's a restriction within the State Patrol on chokeholds. I was wondering if you can elaborate on what the details are of that and how that all began. And is there a reason why that hasn't spread to other law enforcement agencies?
Well, the patrol basically has a clear practice and guideline and requirement that the carotid artery hold, that is a hold that essentially compresses the artery so that a person loses consciousness. And that cannot be used for the purposes of subduing a person, for getting a person to accept arrest. So it cannot be used for those purposes. And the same is said what you think of as a chokehold, which deprives oxygen to a person. The policy does allow, when the officer's life is in danger, in essence, that particular use, but only in that very limited circumstances. And it's a strong policy, and I believe it has been hewed to, and I'm glad that the patrol is led in this effort. I don't know the full scope of where this is used and not used as far as policies. I talked to Sue Raw, our training officer, today about this. My best survey is that some police forces do have this restriction, but some do not. And I believe we have to have a statewide restriction on the use of this, given the nature of this danger. And so I think it needs to be consistent. It needs to be lawful. It has to be enforceable, and it has to include both city, county, and state agencies. So I'm going to promote that idea, and I hope that we are successful.
Next question comes from Hannah with Cairo Radio.
Hi, Governor. First question, we heard there were several injuries to Seattle police officers over the weekend, and we heard from the police union today that there are officers concerned for their safety. Their families are worried. We're hearing about an East precinct that is going to be abandoned because of fear that they can't hold it. Understanding that there is a need for change, absolutely. I'm wondering what your message would be to the police officers in the state. And then for Secretary Weissman, I'm wondering if you can elaborate just a bit on the recommendations for people who've been at this protest without any symptoms. Are they supposed to stay home for 14 days? And is that just protests where tear gas has been deployed, or all of the protests? And, does it involve, we've seen city council members, reporters out at these. Does it involve everyone?
Well, my message is to police is that we recognize how difficult this job is. It's a tough job. It's a tough job when things are being thrown at you. It's a tough job when you got family home and you want to be able to come home to them. I recognize that. I had a cousin who lost his life in the line of duty working for the King County Sheriff's Department. I have some sense of what that means. And so the message is that it's a really hard job, and we are hopeful that we can have peaceful protests, so that's a little bit easier job. And I know that that the vast majority of these protesters want to be peaceful. It's just a few folks who've created some of this violence. It's so dangerous to people, and it's very frustrating. I've talked to many, many protesters who are angry at these folks who do start to throw things because they just want to have a peaceful protest. So that would be my message.
Next question comes
And
from
again, I think with COVID, I think the thing we really need to come back to here is how do we minimize risk? And that's what we're talking about for no matter what activities we're partaking in. It is better to be outdoors than it is to be indoors in terms of lessening the risk for transmission. It is better to be at least 6 feet away from people than closer to people in terms of reducing transmission. It is absolutely better, as the governor has said, that if you have to be within a closer distance of 6 feet with folks, to wear cloth face covering. So this is all about sort of managing risk. and, if you're ill, stay home. And that's really what we're talking about here. And so if folks have been to a large gathering, they didn't have face coverings, they didn't stay away, those all things increase the risk. And so again, if those are the situations, the best thing then is to just stay home and away from others for 14 days. Again, this is risk management. And if for some reason someone can't do that, then closely monitoring their symptoms. And as soon as they might show any symptoms of COVID, then making sure they isolate themselves, that they get a test, as the governor said earlier, and continue to isolate themselves until they get test results and can feel confident that they aren't actually infected. So this is all, we're really asking people to think about this every day in every part of their lives. We are in a different place now, a different normal, that we need people thinking about these constantly. And the reopening of Washington and the phases gives that consideration. We reduce the number of people that you're in contact with. That gradually increases as we start feeling more comfortable with our ability to respond and more comfortable perhaps with the virus slowing down. So that's what we need people focused on. We need people taking care of themselves and taking care of themselves for the people they love as well.
Hey, Governor, I want to follow up on Hannah's question real quickly. She asked you about the East Precinct, and I know you don't like to get into the local politics and minutia that much, but I'd like to ask you what that symbolizes, that the police department is boarding up that precinct right now and will abandon it. And what do you want the police to do when they're holding a position to protect an asset like that precinct and they're having stuff thrown at them? What do you want them to do, if not use the less lethal methods that they've been using, these techniques? So first of all, the symbolism and what message is being sent by the Seattle Police Department abandoning that East Precinct.
Well, I haven't been advised that that's happening, so I'll hold any comment about that. Obviously, we'd like officers to seek any de-escalation tactic that is available to them and to try to keep themselves safe in a way that reduces violence. That's what we're all looking for, and we all hope that we can accomplish that. Our goal here is the preservation of health and safety for everybody, and that's the goal that we seek to accomplish.
From Breyer with the Seattle Times.
Governor, two questions. One, do you intend to call a special session of the legislature for August now? And second, given the concerns about cutting services and avoiding as many layoffs as possible in state employment, do you intend to not proceed with the 3% cost of living increase in July?
So we have not made decisions on either one of those questions. So we'll make the right decisions at the right time. As I've said, the session could happen when there's a possibility of success and votes for some meaningful step forward. In the financial situation, everything is under consideration, and that's the best I can share with you right now, Brad. No, I just hope people focus on their safety and the recognition that out of this moment, I believe we can forge a more just Washington state. I have seen a lot of interest to accomplish that. And if we band together, keeping our eyes on the prize, I think good things are going to happen. And during that period, I hope people keep themselves safe. So please wash your hands. Thank you.